Chapter 16 Gaust Redmont. "A flock of crows is called a murder," Caitlin said as another crow joined the dozen or so gathering around Quentin's body, Red's fighters having already picked him clean of coins, weapons, even buttons and bangles. "Is that right?" Cody said, his eyes following one crow in particular that broke from the rest of the murder to alight on Red's shoulder. She tossed a seed of some sort up to its mouth that it caught in midair with its beak. The crow remained perched on her shoulder as she gathered the fighters and the free children into a loose group headed for the forest. She paid little attention to Haille and the others, and Haille felt their opportunity slipping away. "We've got to travel with them. We'll be safer. You saw what she did to those slavers," Haille said. "Aye, I did." Val was stone-faced. "She's a legend. You must have heard of her before." "Can't say that I have," Val said. "The heralds in the city are often spreading news of her raids and her exploits," Caitlin said. "That is interesting, because she does not seem to leave many witnesses," Val said. "True observation, Captain. Makes one speculate how those heralds heard about her in the first place." Cody nodded. "Are we going to follow them or not?" Haille asked. Val studied the bodies, the burning wagon, and finally the ragged-looking children herded together and making their way towards freedom. His expression softened. "Always safer in a crowd, I suppose. Anyway, I'd hate to see any harm come to those children." "Great," Haille said, now running to catch up with Red. "So we follow." Red took them on a course deep into the forest. There was no hope of concealing their tracks, so instead, Red pushed for speed. It was not easy for the children who were weary, homesick, and underfed. Nor was the path easy for the horses since it snaked along slippery riverbanks, climbed over outcroppings, and threaded narrow gorges. Cody and Val brought up the rear but not without curses, falling behind only to catch up when Red allowed the children to break and rest. The elk negotiated the path with relative comfort. Less than an hour into their travel, the smallest and weakest children had found their way onto its back. The others seemed to forget their cares, their aching feet, and their grumbling stomachs when it was near them, their pain replaced by wonder. On breaks they would scramble to be the first to lay against its sides, soft and welcoming with fur as they were. It brought to mind, for Haille, a mother wolf, her ferocity tamed for the sake of her squirming, mewling pups. Rain drummed down upon them during the first night. Red and her fighters pushed them all in order to reach a network of caves hidden within a dell where they were sheltered from the weather and safe from attack. Val and Cody helped to build a roaring fire in a ring of stones that Red and her fighters had used before. Sheltered from the weather and hidden from sight by cliffs and evergreens, their boughs thick with beards of moss, even Red's fighters relaxed, collapsing amid their grass cloaks and bows and arrows to fall into deep slumber. This was a shelter Red and her companions used often, for it was stocked with barrels of supplies, including fresh water and hardtack biscuits. The children made a porridge with the biscuits and water. It was tasteless, but it was the first real meal they had eaten in days. Many of the younger children went to sleep soon after. Some of the older ones sat around the fire in silence, poking at its coals with sticks aimlessly until Cody settled down beside them and started to tell stories. Haille was not sure how much of the story was true and how much was invention, but it was entertaining. Haille heard again the tale of Val tricking the Anthorian soldiers into raiding their own supply line. Val pretended to be asleep, but Haille could tell he was listening by the smile formed at the corners of his mouth. Caitlin was asleep with the rest of the smallest children, all nestled against the elk who was wide awake and alert, its luminous eyes reflecting the fire, its ears twitching to the slightest sounds from outside. Haille noticed Red sitting alone near the cave mouth, her eyes focused on raindrops tinkling in a puddle just beyond the shelter of the cave. Her hands held a whetstone, but she had long stopped sharpening the blade. Haille sensed an opportunity, sat down opposite, and studied her. Her body was small and compact, but sinewy like a tumbler or dancer. Her shoulders were square, not unlike a young man's. Her hair was so blonde it was nearly white, and it was so thin that her scalp was visible through her part that ran like a scar across her skull. Her hands were diminutive, and she wore fingerless gloves that wrapped about her wrists for support, as Haille had seen many bowmen do. Most everything on her appeared worn and weathered, as if she had spent many a night over many months and years' exposure to the elements. Her cracked and worn baldric, made of a reddish leather, was slung tightly against her body, its upper strap resting between her breasts. The shoulders of her tunic were faded and fraying, the knees of her breeches patched. Although her face was youngish, even elfin in its appearance, Haille noticed again how her eyes were rayed by more wrinkles than he would expect. She broke her gaze off from the raindrops outside the cave mouth and began sliding her whetstone along her knife with a shick, shick sound. She offered no greeting, and Haille sucked at his teeth, trying to think of something to say. "How did you know Quentin would come out of the wagon when you set fire to it?" She ran the stone across her knife a few more times before answering. "Quentin was a selfish coward. I knew he would want to plead for his life." Haille nodded. "You must have known many men of his like. Slavers, I mean." "Aye." Haille found himself sucking at his teeth again. The quiet that followed was broken only by the shick, shick of the whetstone. "Well, I'm grateful for your protection," he said, getting up. "I guess I should get some sleep." "You'll need it." The next day was relentless. Clouds remained low in the sky, and a fine drizzle fell on them throughout the morning. That, combined with the rain from the night before, made for slow going through mud, high streams, and grass that was heavy with moisture. By mid-morning they were a silent, somber, and soaking procession, the joy of freedom long worn off, and the children asking when they would be allowed to seek their way home. "These parts are not safe," Red told them. "First, we will go to my father's manor. There you will have time to recover from your ordeal, and we will begin the work of returning you to your home." The rains came again in the afternoon. By now, even Val and Cody had dismounted and let the weakest children ride in their saddles. The elk's back was full, so Caitlin walked alongside Haille, who had fallen back from his position at the front where he had followed Red closely the first day. "Not a girl of many words, is she?" Caitlin said. "No," Haille said, trying to hide his disappointment. "But how many true heroes are boastful? But many are merciful." "You still think she should not have killed Quentin?" Caitlin shrugged. "Who am I to judge? Let us hope we don't ever end up on the wrong side of her blade." In the late afternoon they passed a structure made of branches and rotting thatch. It was really no more than a lean-to, constructed to shelter field workers from the rain. But at the sight of it, Red's fighters gave a cheer. "We are at the border of my father's lands," Red said. "We will reach the manor by nightfall." Their pace picked up after that. Soon they passed along rock walls separating plowed and fallow fields. Although they were safely on Red's family lands, they were still a great distance from any permanent settlement. The holdings were endless, and it took the rest of the evening to cross them. Closer in, the land seemed to be less farm and more fortress. They passed through rings of pickets constructed of sharpened tree branches, earthen walls, and planted brambles. Men with weathered and scarred faces stood guard there and saluted Red as she passed. The light of day had given way to darkness when the flickering windows of the manor house finally came into view. 3 stories of stone and timber were visible across the field of rye that surrounded it. Moonlight shone on the slate roof that was still dark from the day's rains. Shadows danced across its face as figures passed among fires and torches lit around its own curtain wall. Haille's attention fell to the warm lights flickering from within the windows and the promise of rest. Like many great manors, a small town of buildings surrounded the main house. Although finally free, Haille was surprised they did not stop right away at the smithy. The children, their chains broken, still were burdened with manacles, as were Val and Cody from their imprisonment at the manor in Kinth. But by the look of the smithy and the men around it, Haille thought it was best that they waited until morning. The men were scarred, hardened, and cruel-looking, and although they greeted Red with respect, Haille did not like the way they looked upon the children and himself, with faces empty of pity. Not what he expected of men used to breaking bonds. The whole property had less the feel of a family farm and more the air of an army encampment. They passed a tavern, and in place of the usual songs and laughter customary of such an establishment, Haille heard shouts and steel as a fight either broke out or was broken up. Val and Cody sensed the atmosphere as well, and moved protectively to either side of the gaggle of children. Red marched onward, leading them to a courtyard at the front of the great house. After the last of the children, the horses, and the elk had passed through, the fighters closed the gate behind them and locked it. Red's fighters showed none of the looseness they had exhibited the night before in the caves. Rather, they were the opposite, standing in a circle around the children as if to protect them, or even trap them. Only Red was relaxed, drinking from a flask that had been hidden in her satchel. "Come, come, young ones, to meet my father," she said between tips of the small bottle into her mouth. She wiped her lips with the back of her hand and sucked her breath in between her teeth before leading them into the east wing of the building. Inside was a great hall with a high ceiling supported by wide columns of mortared stone. The rafters were darkened with soot from a fire pit that ran the length of the room. The children lined up along it, pushing and shoving to get close and warm themselves, even though only coals were glowing there. Haille was more interested in the walls lined with broken swords, shattered shields, and captured colors, trophies of battle. And from the sheer number it was clear that Red's father, or his fighters, like Red's, were used to winning. The children settled along the fire pit, crouched down close to the coals, the soft light exaggerating their already diminutive nature, their sunken eyes, their bony frames, beneath clothes that were no more than rags. Red turned up her bottle again for another drink. She was staggering, her face flushed and her eyes heavily lidded, when a double door on the far side of the room opened, and men in boiled leather armor and equipped with clubs and maces entered the room. Val and Cody stiffened. The men lined the walls, their faces obscured by helms made of dark metal, their numbers growing to 24 before Haille lost count. They stood in wide stances, their hands folded over belt buckles, their expressions flat, an impressive display of loyalty and order. But why? Haille wondered. These were their liberators. What need had they to intimidate children? Finally, a tall and slender man appeared in the doorway. He was so tall it seemed unnatural. His head almost touched the keystone of the doorway. His hair was like Red's, so blonde that it was almost white. His, by contrast, was short, its ends sticking up like the teeth of a crown. A cream-colored robe embroidered with silver thread draped his entire figure and shimmered like polished steel as he walked. He stepped down the stairs towards the fire pit, his feet kicking out the edges of his robe, and cupped one of the children's faces in his hand. This was a small boy, one with a deformed arm and only 2 curled, useless fingers. "A beautiful face," he said in a gentle voice, his countenance darkening as he lifted up the stunted arm, the boy turning his eyes to the floor in shame. As if just noticing the other children gathered, he nodded to Red and studied them, his eyes briefly pausing on Val and Cody. "So this is what you brought me," he said in a voice that sounded like a croak from deep in his throat. "The children were the chattel of Quentin Stills. I killed him," Red said. "The 4 there," she said, gesturing to Cody, Val, Caitlin, and Haille, "joined us." Haille wondered if he should say something or perhaps wait for Val to speak. He had not known that such a powerful but unknown lord sponsored Red and her exploits. Although it made sense to him, how else could she continue her raids or arm her fighters without help? So this man was the power behind the legend. Next to the light of the coals, he looked more like a grandfather than father, his face sagging like the wax of a melting candle, his hands covered in age spots. If this was indeed Red's father, Haille wondered how old she was, or how young her mother must have been when wed to this old man. Then again, Red, with those lines around her eyes, was perhaps older than Haille had first guessed. It didn't seem right. Nothing felt right. The guards, the lack of greetings, the way Red was drinking. Haille realized a lump had formed in his throat, and he swallowed just as Red's father began to speak. "Children, you were the property of Quentin Stills. Have no illusion of freedom now, for your lives belong to me, and I, Gaust Redmont, am a harsh master." He stopped, nodded to the boy with the withered arm, and the closest guard stepped forward and in one swift motion smashed in his skull with his club. 1 strike, 2, and a 3rd, and it was over. His dead body fell forward into the coals. The children screamed collectively and rushed for Red, for Val, for Cody. Red stepped back behind the wall of guards who wrestled the children to the floor and began to hogtie them. Val and Cody had no more chance to grab their swords before they were outnumbered and overpowered. Haille took Caitlin by the arm and made for the door they had entered, but 3 men descended upon them. Haille bit one on the exposed wrist and heard him scream behind his mask. He struck Haille with the back of his hand and shook him by the collar of his tunic. The folio page fluttered out of Haille's pocket and drifted down to the floor, a boot stomping down on the image of Jasmine. Haille reached for it, but one of the men twisted Haille's arm behind him, while another picked up the stolen page. "Can you read this, boy?" Haille did not answer until he felt his arm nearly crack.
"Oh, yes."
"Good. That might be useful."